Hi, Nutrition 101. Welcome to Chapter 3, From Meals to Molecules. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about digestion and absorption, as well as the hierarchy of life. So when we look at the hierarchy of life, there are a number of different levels of organization. We have atoms. If we think about nutrients, a nutrient that can be as small as an atom is a mineral. Then we have molecules. So all the rest of the nutrients, our carbs, our protein, our fats, our vitamins, and our minerals and water can be as small as molecules. When we look at molecules, we talk a little bit in nutrition about organic versus inorganic molecules. Something that's organic contains carbon, and something that's inorganic doesn't contain carbon. You might remember this from chapter 1. So the molecules in nutrition that contain carbon are carbs, protein, fat, as well as vitamins, right? And then minerals don't contain carbon because they can be as small as atoms. And our water doesn't contain carbon because we all know that it's H2O. When we look at organelles are little workers in each cell. So there are almost like mini organs that function within cells to perform different functions. Cells are the smallest units of life. Atoms would be considered the smallest units of matter. So cells are our smallest units of life. And each of our cells contains the same genetic information. However, that genetic information is expressed differently depending on the type of cell, and those groups of cells that have similar expression of genes form tissues. So tissues are groups of cells that have a specific function. Then tissues form together to create organs. Organs combine to create organ systems. Today we're going to be talking about the organ system of the digestive system. And then we have our organisms, right? Groups of organisms come together to form populations. So we could call our class a population. And then our populations come together, not just, animals, but plants and all those other things as well to create ecosystems. So in this class, we break it all the way down into these individual nutrients, which can be as small as molecules and atoms, and then talk about how they work in our body in order to create us, organisms, and talk about how we function in in populations and in ecosystems. So this is just showing this in a little bit different way. Our atoms on the periodic table, our molecules, groups of atoms, our cells, the smallest living thing, our tissues, which are groups of various cells that come together to perform a specific function, which then come together to make organs, and a variety of organs make organ systems, and then we have our organism. So we have 11 different organ systems, and you really could say that all of these are involved in nutrition because all of our organ systems are made up of a variety of different nutrients, and they all stimulate things like hunger, fullness, breathing, getting oxygen to our cells, all of which are so important in some part of nutrition, whether it's digestion, absorption, metabolism, function, or excretion. So we have our nervous system, we have our respiratory system, we have our urinary system, pretty important for excreting waste. And something to note, anything that is undigested material is excreted through the digestive system, so through the feces, but anything that enters our body, right, that gets absorbed, but we need to eliminate, that would be typically excreted through the urinary system. Could be excreted through, breath, through the respiratory system too. Could also be excreted through the skin as well. Then we have our reproductive system, our cardiovascular system, which is quite important in transporting all of our nutrients around our body. Our lymphatic system, which is important in transporting fat-soluble substances around our body as well. Our muscular system, which of course contains lots of protein that provide our structure. Our skeletal system, our endocrine system, which is all our hormones. Our integumentary system, which is our skin, hair, nails, and sweat glands. So this, of course, will help us excrete as well through things like sweat. And then our digestive system, which is what we're going to be covering in a lot of depth today. So if we look at our digestive system or our gastrointestinal system, We have two different parts of this system. We first have our GI tract, which is what food actually passes through, and you could think about the food that passes through the GI tract never actually enters the body. So, something with a lot of insoluble fiber, you can see remnants of it looking almost the same as when you put the remnants in your mouth to begin with, things like corn or things like our highly fibrous vegetables and things like that. Sometimes you see them coming out in the feces looking quite similar. And it doesn't mean they don't serve a purpose, but it means that their purpose is in the GI tract. Their purpose is not to assimilate and create, structure or regulation or energy in the body. So in our GI tract, we first have our mouth. Then we have our pharynx, where the food is swallowed, our esophagus, where food moves down to the stomach through a process called peristalsis. Our stomach, which churns and mixes food, has a highly acidic environment. Our small intestines, which include three parts, the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum, and that's where most of our absorption occurs. And then the large intestine, which includes the cecum, the ascending colon, the transverse colon, and the descending colon, and then the sigmoid colon, and then we have the rectum and the anus. And so those are the parts, the components that the food actually travels through. We also have some different glands and different organs that secrete things into the GI tract, and those would be called accessory organs. So you could call the salivary glands accessory organs. They secrete bile into the mouth, right? We have the liver, which makes bile, the gallbladder, which stores bile and releases it into the small intestine when it's needed, and the pancreas. And the pancreas releases these bicarbonate ions that are almost like a baking soda. They neutralize all the acid that comes down from the stomach. And they also secrete, the pancreas also secretes a number of different enzymes that aid in digestion. And then we have, different components in the small intestine that also contain some enzymes that aid in digestion. But when we look at, the main components of the accessory organs versus the GI tract, you can think GI tract is what the food travels through, and the accessory organs are what secrete extras into the GI tract. So what are these secretions? So these secretions include mucus. Mucus is secreted from mucosal cells that line the digestive tract, and it moistens, lubricates, and protects. So it's going to make sure that we have a smooth trip through the GI tract. Enzymes are proteins that speed up reactions, and in the digestive tract, they help us break down larger molecules such as starch and large proteins and large triglycerides or big fat molecules into smaller ones that can fit into the mucosal cells in the small intestine and be transported for absorption. And that would be what absorption is. It's that transport across the small intestine, into the body, into the blood if it's water soluble, or into the lymph if it's fat soluble. And then we have hormones, and hormones are chemicals secreted from the cells which travel through the bloodstream to signal cells in another part of the body. So we have a lot of different hormones coming from our endocrine system that are signaling us to do things like make our stomach churn or salivate or crave some foods, right? We have appetite and we have hunger. Appetite is that psychological desire to eat. We have some hormones involved in that, as well as some hormones involved in hunger, which is the physiological responses that our body has in order to want to eat. So this is just an example of how the digestive enzymes would work. So you can see that large carbohydrate molecules, which are starch, they contain really long chains of a simple sugar called glucose. We need to break those chains into individual glucoses in order to absorb them. So all these little hexagons that you see here need to be just individually absorbed. So since we have these long chains, we need something to help us do that. So these enzymes are going to hydrolyze or break down. They add water to the molecule to break down these starch molecules or amyloses in order to make them as small as a glucose so they can fit through that wall of the small intestine and get into our bloodstream, where then they can be carried out to be used as energy or stored as fat eventually. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on in the mouth. So our mechanical and chemical digestion begins in the mouth. We see that there are some secretions in the mouth, so this is where starch would begin to be digested. So when we talk about enzymes, they usually end in ASE. So you can see the amylase is going to digest the starch, and another name for starch is amylose. So in sugars, the ACEs digest the OSes. So we have the amylase, the salivary amylase, digesting the amylose, or the starch, as well as other substances. So that would be called chemical digestion. So chemical digestion is that adding of the enzymes to break apart the larger molecules into smaller molecules. We also have some mechanical stuff going on. So we have the teeth are breaking down food particles. We have the tongue, it's helping mix food and aiding in chewing. And then the saliva also contains some lubricants, which just are going to help us increase the surface area of the food molecules, so then they're easier for enzymes to access. Next, we have the pharynx. So the pharynx is part of both the digestive system and the respiratory system. If you've ever had to give somebody the Heimlich maneuver, you know that the food went down the wrong tube, right? The epiglottis, the purpose of that is to block food from entering the trachea and the lungs during swallowing. So if you inhale your food rather than swallow your food, then you block, that trachea and you choke, right? So if we don't inhale our food and we swallow our food instead, then we can really make sure that the food goes down the right tube, which is going to be our esophagus versus our trachea. So if food enters that airway, it can be removed by coughing or the Heimlich maneuver. So here's some vocabulary, before we finish off this little lecture here. Here's some vocabulary to remember. The partially digested food after you've gone through the mechanical digestion in the mouth is called a bolus. So the bolus contains some mucus, contains some saliva, is the food that you consumed. It's kind of partially digested at this point if there's starch in there because you broke down a little bit of that amylose or starch into smaller pieces. Then we have our pharynx, right? The epiglottis is going to cover the trachea to allow that passageway to the lungs to be blocked. And then the epiglottis will return to its original position once the bolus is passed and that airway is open again. So that's our chewing and swallowing here. So far we've gone through the hierarchy of life. We've gone through the main components of the GI tract as well as the accessory organs of the digestive system. And we've talked a little bit about chewing and swallowing, both the chemical and mechanical digestion involved. Next time, we're going to be talking about what happens from the esophagus and beyond. So we'll talk a little bit about digestion and absorption, just finishing off from after we swallow. So stay tuned for part 2 of chapter 3.